Hey, thanks for joining me today for episode 61 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jaime, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today I'm going to share a podcasting 101 topic, engaging with your listeners. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flint Media. Listen in and let's do this. All right, so on the last episode, I shared with you my presentation at Afros and Audio. And it was my live presentation during their virtual conference, their 4th annual virtual conference. And when I was editing it back, I really liked it. I really liked how I was able to record something live to drive, as we say, which I'll explain in a second, and not have to do a whole bunch of editing other than removing those engagement pieces of content that wouldn't have made any sense for you. I just liked how I sounded, and it gave me an idea. The idea is maybe I don't need to be so prepared. And I don't mean that I don't have to spend time, really thinking about the episode and all that kind of stuff. I just mean that I don't have to write down as much because I really know a lot. And when I was doing that presentation, all I had in front of me were my slides, and those are still available. So if you want them, you can just email me for them. But if you see them, there's not a whole heck of a lot on there. And I was just flowing and going. And it was great. And I was really, really proud of myself. So that gave me an idea. Why don't I? And this is, I want to make a good point here because I always talk about how you should be open to evolving your show. And that means a lot of different things. And this show is about to evolve because this got me thinking. Why don't I take a little bit of pressure off myself now that I'm comfortable in recording this show? It's been well over a year. I'm comfortable recording the show. I'm comfortable in doing something that doesn't have a co-host. I can flow, and I'm confident in that. I know what I'm talking about. So moving forward, at least I'm experimenting today. Maybe it'll be moving forward. I'm doing something that feels a lot more live to drive. Few notes, basically just some bullet points, and I'm going to let it go and flow. Now, what does live to drive mean? It essentially means, imagine you're recording for radio. They're recording live, and whatever comes out of their mouths ends up on their airways, unless they have that dump button because somebody accidentally cursed. What they say is what you get. And I really liked the way that felt. And I record much more live to drive for the Owl podcast and for the Podfest podcast when I have a co-host because you're bouncing off somebody. So I'm going to do that here. Even though I'm not bouncing off anybody, I'm going to do this episode as a more live to drive. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about engaging with your audience. I'm going to cover 3 things. Number 1, I'm going to go through the benefits of audience engagement. It sounds really obvious. Yeah, of course you want your audience to engage, but really why? Why? So we're going to cover that. Then I'm going to be talking about how to create space for your listeners to engage. It's one thing to want it, but you have to set the table for your listeners to actually engage with you. And last but not least, because it's perfect timing, I'm going to share a listener email that I just got the other day, which goes so perfect. It's audience engagement. Look at that. It actually somehow inspired this episode. So I'm going to be sharing that with you at the end as a case in point. So to start off, still the best way of growing your audience is through organic word of mouth. There's a reason for that. Imagine you've seen a trailer for an upcoming movie 3 or 4 times and it's piqued your interest, right? But you're not so sure if you want to actually go to the theater or buy it on streaming or whatever, right? So what do? You ask somebody their opinion. You either throw it to Facebook and you get a whole bunch of responses, or you text your bestie or whatever, right? You ask people you know for their opinion because the opinions of those whom you know are much more valuable in your eyes than the opinion of some rando. Like the person who's being paid to call it awesome in the trailer, right? And so I could sit here all day long and talk about, yes, my show is awesome, but no one's going to believe me because I'm kind of biased. You're going to believe your friend, right? And your friend is going to believe you when you share this show, hint, 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 because still the best way of growing your audience is with organic word of mouth. Nothing can beat that. It is very, very sticky. And what I mean by that is, while there are other methods that might gain a large audience of eyes on you, it'll be a blip. Whereas when somebody comes into your show as a listener organically, they're much more likely to also enjoy it and to stick around and want to hear it again and again and again and again. It's less of that flash in the pan kind of impact. It's more of that steady, slow, upward growth. And that's what you want. Not necessarily slow, but you want a steady upward growth. That's what you want. So organic word of mouth is the best way to do that. And engaging with your audience can really propel that forward. Also, audience engagement can provide really good content for your show. I'll go into a lot of different ways that can happen, but then as an example in real time, I'll share with you an email I got from a listener. That is content now for this show. Also, if you're trying to build a community around your podcast, and I encourage that in like 90% of the situations, you do want to put an effort to try to build a community. So if you are trying to build a community, the only way that's going to work is if your community feels like they can engage with you in some way, shape, or form. Now, some communities, they're engaging with the community leader really, really closely one-on-one. Some communities, it's more like they know that they're going to get that newsletter once a month or something extra special in their inbox or in their mailbox or whatever. Not necessarily something personal, but they're part of the community. So whatever that means for you or could mean for you, growth of your community happens through audience engagement. Audience engagement also gives you a chance to hear directly about how your content is landing. I mean, listen, you'll hear why. I got super jazzed when I got this email that I'm going to share because it let me know that my content is really landing. And it gave me confidence that I still know what I'm talking about in terms of SEO. That's a little hint on the content of the email. But it's true. You can hear directly from your listeners and they're going to tell you if they like what you're doing or not. And you're only going to get that feedback really if you ask for it and you create a space for them to give it to you. Also, when listeners are able to share something with you and then that content has been brought onto the show, maybe they've been given a shout out. Again, I'm going to give you lots of different ideas here. But however it happens, if you bring your listener and their message and their thoughts and their opinions and their existence into your show, that listener is going to feel more bonded to that show. I remember way back in the day when I was first starting podcasting with a little show called Curve the Cube, I wrote to Libsyn because Libsyn had a show called The Feed, and The Feed allowed you to submit basically a promo for your show and they would share it on their show. Audience engagement, right? So I remember doing this. I don't remember what I recorded. I don't remember what the submission was, but I submitted something about Curve the Cube, and lo and behold, they played my promo on their show a couple months later. And it was really, really exciting. First of all, I was listening to every episode because I wanted to see, is it going to be this one? Is it going to be this one? Is it going to be this one? They made me wait. But anyways, it's okay. It's all good. But even after I waited and I heard it, it made me love them even more. And so I was a diehard listener for a long time after that. Also, if you're engaging with your listeners, there's an opportunity there for your listener to become part of the show in a much more direct and solid way, like a potential guest or even a future co-host. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of where I've seen that happen. And last but certainly not least, and I'm sure there's a lot more reasons why engaging with your audience is awesome. I'm forgetting a couple of them. So if anything else lands with you, please let me know. But engaging with your audience can also lead to sponsorships. It can lead to referrals for your business. It can lead to all kinds of things. The closer you allow your audience to feel like they are to you, the more precious you're going to be to them. The more they're going to care and want to see you succeed, the more the value you're providing for them, the more they're going to be your champion. So if you can engage with your audience, you can end up having an audience member who just really shines and is all about everything that you're doing. And that could lead to some really, really cool things down the road. All right. So those are just some of the many benefits of audience engagement. So how do you create a space for your listeners to engage? It can be really, really frustrating if you're a listener and you're excited to send an email or to shoot a message and you can't figure out how to contact them. This actually happened to me a couple times. I can't figure out how to contact the person I really want to contact. And it could be because they were a podcaster, a number of things. But it's really, really frustrating. So you want to make it super, super easy. Now, you may be thinking about social media and stuff like that as I talk about audience engagement. And social media can be a huge piece of that puzzle, massive piece of that puzzle. In fact, right now, as I'm recording this, I'm also recording a time-lapse video. So I can share it on social later. So you guys will see me recording this video. But anyways, you see that on Instagram. But social media is not going to be the topic that I get into on this episode. That'll be for later. Maybe that'll be one of my first episodes in 2023. But what I'm going to be talking about today are things that are rooted within your podcast content itself. The content on your show, the content in your show notes, those kinds of things. So, okay. Number one, speaking of show notes, you take the time to put your show notes together. As you've heard me say on other episodes, it can really be beneficial for your SEO if you have a section of your show notes that contains links to resources for you, resources for your guest, but also resources for anything that you mention in the show. So as an example, if you're recording a podcast that's really informative and you share a resource, then make sure you say it'll be in the show notes. Drive people to your show notes, okay? This is really, really important. It can really, really help you get people into your show notes, clicking through things. It obviously helps with your SEO, but once they're in your show notes, once they're there, for whatever was the main reason why they decided to go there, because they're looking for your email or a resource or whatever it is, when they decide to go there, now they're seeing all of your show notes. And that's what you want. So you want them to have full exposure to all of that content that you're putting together. If it's kind of frustrating when you put stuff together, a podcast, show notes, whatever, and nobody sees it. So mention your resources throughout your episode, but tell people I'm putting a link in the show notes. And then make sure you do. Please, for the love of God. Also, very, very common. So I'm starting off with like the low-hanging fruit, right? The stuff that's much more obvious. So links in the show notes, but also ending calls to action. So at the end of your episode typically is when you're going to want to have a couple calls to action, one or two. You don't want to overstuff. But those calls to action can include sending you an email. It can ask for people to follow you on social media. Just a few minutes ago, I did something similar. That it wasn't in the close, obviously, but I did something similar just a few moments ago. So you heard that. But ending calls to action can be a really great place to tell your audience how to engage with you. Oftentimes when somebody's listening to a show, they're gaining that value, they're gaining that value, but they also might start to have some questions that pop up. And they know that you're the resource for those answers to those questions. So make sure if they're waiting for how to ask you those questions, for the love of God, at the end of the episode, tell them to send in your email, to ask you in your DMs, or whatever other method is appropriate. A form on your page, what have you. And speaking of forms, that is the next thing on my list. So if you have a website for your show, which please, if you have create a website for your show, or at least a landing page for it on your other website. But wherever your show exists in the ether webs, try to incorporate some sort of form on your page for them to fill out. Now, it can be as simple as getting added to your mailing list, and that can be how you end up engaging with them over time by sending out e-blasts and those kinds of things. Or it could be something more than that. It could be that when they fill out the form, their email address still gets added to your mailing list, woohoo! But that form, they're filling it out because the promise on the other side is that they're going to get more information. So you can have, for example, a PDF that you put together of your best tips or ideas for business over the holidays, whatever it is, anything that you can provide extra value in a PDF that can be downloaded. Your listeners can fill out a form, their email gets sent to your mailing list so you can engage with them on an ongoing basis. But you're also then allowing them to download a piece of valuable content from you that's extra. So that's really, really helpful, because the more content from you that your audience is downloading and engaging in, the better for your show overall, the better for your community overall, the better for your brand overall, the better for your growth overall. I bet you didn't know that was the word I was going to use. Did you? All right, up next, since I was kind of in the realm of website stuff where your forms will exist on a website, one of the things that you can do on your website is you can install something called SpeakPipe. It's this really, really easy and simple plugin. I love it. But what it does is it puts, and you actually can go to floridapodcastnetwork.com and see an example of this, but it puts this button on your website where people can click it, and then they can record a voice message that gets sent to your inbox. And then you can use that voice message as content for your show. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. SpeakPipe is just one of them. You can also just say, hey, record something on your phone and then just send it to me. It's super easy. But by asking for people to send voice messages, it gives you the opportunity to do a couple things. Number one, they could just tell you how your content is landing. That's so important, right? What kind of questions they have, which can build out your future content. Also super important. But the real kicker is that you can then take that voicemail and include it in the show. So instead of you just reading their email, like you'll hear me in a moment, read a listener's email, you're actually hearing their voice, and that listener is hearing their own voice on your show. So just like when I sent in my promo for Curve the Cube to Libsyn Show the Feed, and I heard that on there, and I was so jazzed, and it made me this ridiculously loyal listener for a ridiculously long time. The same thing will happen with you. If you allow your listeners to be heard on your show, it makes that listener lean in for the long haul. And what I've also found is, I'm not even sure what the psychological word for it is, but when an audience member hears another person being shouted out, another listener being regarded, another listener's email being read, whatever it is, even if it's not their own, that other listener feels really happy and excited for the opportunity that the person whose email and voice was heard got to have. It gets them excited to know that the host is allowing people in that way. And even if I never then submit my own voicemail, there's something about experiencing somebody else involved that makes you really happy. You know, think about anytime I remember watching David Copperfield, the magician, when I was a kid on television, and you'd bring an audience member up and the audience eats it up because they feel almost like they're on stage too. It's kind of the same thing. I'm sure there's a technical term for that. If you know it, please email me, Jaime. That's Jaime at flintstonemedia.com. I would love to know it. I studied psychology for many years. I have no idea what that's called, but I'm sure it's a thing. Okay, so let's move away from the website for now and talk about some other things. Another way that you can get your audience to engage with you, and this doesn't work necessarily for every show and every topic point, but if it does work for you, product reviews can be really, really strong. So as an example, let's say I'm a candle maker. I'm top of mind because I just interviewed a candle maker on the Owl podcast, and she sent me home with a beautiful candle. C'est la luz. Shout out. So anyways, it could be that you have actual products, right? And then your listeners are reviewing your actual products. But that might not be the case. But it could be, which would be awesome. It could also be that there's a product that a sponsor is asking you to have a listener review. That's something that Horse Radio Network does really, 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 really well. They'll have their sponsors send a piece of merchandise to one of their diehard listeners, one of their super fans, to be able to try it out. So that listener not only gets the product, but then they get to be involved by providing a review of that product, honest review of that product on the show. So it can be really neat. So you can do product reviews for your own stuff. It can be a way of you working with a sponsor to do a product review if you allow your listeners to do it. So there are different ways that you can do it. Now, I'll share another way. This is a spin on the product review thing. So another thing that you can do is, let's say you have a service. Your show is based on a service. For example, my show is based on podcast production services at the end of the day, right? They're people whose shows are based on financial planning or whatever it is. If you have that kind of consultative service, one thing that you can do is reach out to a listener who could use your services, but maybe can't afford to pay. This is the best opportunity for this, but can be an illustration in real time. So what you do is you reach out to them and you say, hey, I would love to do this project on an ongoing basis with you. And you work with them as if they are legitimately your client. And over time, every so often, maybe once a month or what have you, you welcome them in to give an update on the work you guys are doing together. It illustrates a couple of things, but I want to make something really, really clear. This is not an opportunity to turn your show into an infomercial, okay? I cannot put that in bright neon letters big enough. And that can be a quick, slippery slope. You don't want that. It is about leaning into the value that you're giving your audience. So if, for example, if you are a financial advisor and one of the lessons you're trying to teach people is how to be better at budgeting their family finances, then you can have someone who you're helping budget their family finances come in and give updates on how they're working with you over time. So it's value for your listeners because they're going to see how things evolve. They're going to see the timetable of stuff. They're going to know that things don't happen overnight. They're going to get really into the weeds and nuances of a particular case study, all that good stuff. So if you're able to do that with one of your listeners, it can be beautiful. I'll give you an example of something that Horse Radio Network does, somewhat similar. So they are in the horse world, and in the horse world, there are a lot of competitions. I mean, a lot. And some of these are one-day competitions. You go into the ring, you and your horse do your thing, and you're done. Some of them last for days, weeks, even months. Incredible, right? These races. And so they'll have a listener that they'll follow as they're going through this, and they'll do regular check-ins like every week. And it's so powerful because it's the exact kind of content value that the audience is looking for anyway. That listener feels even more bonded because they're highlighted in such a way. And the listeners that aren't that listener, they're excited for that listener, and they're leaning in because they know clearly you're demonstrating as a host that you're walking the walk and you really, really want people to improve. And here's an illustration in real time of how you can do exactly what I'm talking about on this show. Yay! Crowd goes wild. So that is another thing that you can do. That was under the umbrella of product reviews, but it's also a review of your service and allowing your listener to tell the story by engaging with you over the long haul and doing these regular check-ins. It can be such great content. Also, you can have your listeners just contribute content. Now, we do this on the Podfest podcast all the time. In fact, it's the basis of the pod. We couldn't have the Podfest podcast if we didn't have our listeners contributing content. So how it works is we have basically this general constant call to action. Just send us tips, send us tips. So if you're a past speaker at any past Podfest, virtual, in person, what have you, or if you're going to be the speaker in the Podfest in January, you're qualified, you can send in a tip, and it doesn't have to be related to what you've talked about in your presentation at a conference. It can be about anything podcast related. So a listener of our show hears that and they're like, ooh, I have some tips and I get free exposure. This is amazing. So all they have to do is record 2 to 3 minutes. And then at the end of their share, they can let people know how to connect with them, mention their podcast, mention their website, whatever. So it works really, really well for that particular listener to contribute content. But then again, for the people who aren't the ones contributing the content, they're excited for the one who did. But also, this also does another thing. This idea does one more thing that the other ideas haven't done so far. It allows other people's brain cells to contribute to your show. So no matter how seasoned I am as a podcaster, as a host, as a producer, I am of the mind that you should always keep learning. And this is a great opportunity to always keep learning. In fact, there is an editing tip shared maybe 3-4 episodes ago of the Podfest podcast. I'm like, that's brilliant. And I jotted it down and I incorporated it now into my process. But for our listeners of the Podfest podcast, they would have the same reaction, but even more because they're excited that somebody else got to be a part of it. And they're thinking, how can I be a part of it? Now, obviously, we have that qualifier. You have to be a Podfest speaker, but you don't have to have that qualifier. You could just have it for any of your listeners, and they'll get the signal that they can contribute content and be heard on the show. And it's really, really exciting. Now, there are a lot more examples that I could give you. There's lots of examples on the Horse Radio Network side of things where we get people to contribute content. But the idea is to ask your audience to get involved with your show. And that can be a direct contribution of content, or it can be, hey, throw us your ideas for the show, or hey, what are your questions that you want me to lean in and answer on these upcoming episodes? Whatever it is, if they feel like they're contributing to the content and the direction of your show, they're going to feel a million times more bonded to it and excited to share it. So I hope this has given you some ideas for your own show, right? Mentioning resources throughout your episode, getting into those calls to action at the end, but also have a form on your website for people to send their information to you, their questions to you. Ask for voice messages, do some product reviews or reviews of your service, or allow a listener to benefit from your brain power over time and do regular check-ins on your show. Have them come in as a guest co-host. I didn't get into that one. That's also a really fun idea. Sometimes your listener is so excited and they're just really jazzed about everything you're dropping down. And that listener, reach out to them, have a phone call with them, and then invite them to be your special guest co-host on an episode. It can be a lot of fun. And they can also maybe even start contributing content on a regular basis. In fact, this happened on another show that I produced, the Florida Beer Podcast, hosted by Dave Butler. So another gentleman named Steve loved what he was doing on that show. And they started talking and communicating. And now Steve oftentimes goes to the recordings with Dave, and you'll hear Steve on the recordings too. Like, he is in it. He has become part of it. And people saw that evolution and ate it up. It's fantastic. So go beyond just asking for reviews. Go beyond just asking for people to subscribe. Really, really look at your show and think about how can people get engaged beyond social media. Let's not do that easy stuff. Let's think about it much more creatively than that. And the most important thing, beyond anything else I've said today, create really good content that makes people want to engage with you. Okay. And speaking on that note, I'm going to now share that email that I got at the end of the week, this last week, from a listener. He says, "Hi, Jaime. My name is name redacted. I originally learned about you from the Podfest podcast and then started listening to Podcasting Your Brand and most recently the Owl podcast." I mean, side note, no, this is me, not the email. I'm his fan now. That is awesome. Okay, continuing the email. I was listening to Podcasting Your Brand, episode 58, a few weeks ago, and then the follow-up of episode 59. I didn't know you were a website designer and developer as well, but it was very obvious that you had knowledge and experience once you started talking about websites for your podcast and SEO. I have been in the creative industries for over 32 years as a designer, graphic and web photographer and videographer. When I heard you speaking about your WordPress experience and SEO, it was like music to my ears. I'm so glad you presented your listeners the importance of having a website for their podcast and that social media is not your website. I can't tell you how many times I said those same words to prospects. Your message resonates with me, and that's why I'm contacting you today. Mic drop, boom. He goes on from there, but it was just an incredibly perfect example for this episode today, because obviously I created content that resonated with him. And inspired him to engage with me. That is what you want. And he gave me feedback. That was phenomenal. And then, yes, he went on from there. And here's what's great. The rest of that email was also talking about his business and stuff. And it gave me thinking, maybe there's an opportunity here beyond just this singular email exchange. So we have a call scheduled. So this is really, really cool. And this is the kind of thing that can happen with really solid audience engagement. But that audience engagement is going to be inspired because you have really solid content. And one more way that I want to drop on you as a means of engaging with your listeners, you've heard me talk about it before, it's the OWL app. So as one last quick mention, you can monetize your expertise on the OWL app, not just engage with your audience, but actually get monetized too by having them pick your brain on there. So OWL is spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's. Download the app today. Get your $10 credit with my referral code PL954123. And here's what's awesome. Once you are in OWL, once you are in there as an expert, mention it on your show as the best way for people to reach out to you, and then go live on there a lot. And it's amazing how many of my listeners, thank you listeners, have actually reached out to me on the OWL app to get that one-on-one on-demand coaching session. So that's one more thing that you can do. And of course, the app is the basis for my latest show. You heard me a minute ago, the OWL Podcast, also spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's. So listen in to the OWL Podcast to connect, learn, and grow. And also don't forget to check out the Podfest podcast. As mentioned a minute ago, Glenn and I get tips from past Podfest speakers, some of the best minds in the industry. And those lessons become tracks that we present. It was almost a mini conference on each episode. So it's a lot of fun. And the next in-person Podfest conference is happening in January. So come meet me in Orlando. Head to podfestexpo.com for tickets. And up next on episode 62, we'll be doing something different once again. It's going to be my last episode of the year, so I can take a bit of a holiday break. But I'm going to be going through my podcaster's holiday guide with you, sharing a bunch of ideas that you can use in your podcasting to get fully into this holiday season. And then this show will be on a mini break, though you can still catch me on both the Podfest podcast and the OWL podcast. And of course, in 2023, I'll continue bringing you a ton more information to help you be the best podcaster that you can be. So if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Be sure you do. And if you have any questions for me that I can tee up to answer in my first episodes next year, find me on OWL, or you can email me at Jaime, Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. And in the meantime, I have a whole bunch of free tips on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips. Thanks for tuning into Podcasting Your Brand. In this chapter of the show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid common mistakes and propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have questions or are interested in becoming a sponsoring brand of this show, don't be shy. Reach out to me at Jaime, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. It's producer Jaime signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.